Hello there, Amazing Race fans, and welcome to the show. This is Jason's Amazing Race Recap 38, episode number 7. And on today's show, we're going to talk about what happened to our racers in episode 7 of season 38 of The Amazing Race. So if you're ready, let's get started. I'm your host, Jason Mogul. All right, well, we have 7 teams left. They're still in Croatia, and they will be leaving soon here and headed to Romania. Tucker and Eric are in first place, and they leave at 11:55 p.m., so that's pretty late. That's almost midnight. And they head to a travel agency to get airplane tickets. Now, when teams need airplane tickets, there are several choices they can use to obtain them. One is they could use the taxi driver's phone to look up on the internet and order tickets that way. Because they have a credit card, apparently they have a credit card they use for plane tickets. So that's one way. Another way is that if they know about it and they're in a hotel, they could use the hotel computer and do basically the same thing. Just order tickets online, but do it from the hotel computer. Another way is to go to the airport and to buy tickets at the ticket counter at the airport. But I think in this particular case, because it is almost midnight, those ticket counters may not have been open. So the other choice is to use a travel agency. And so here it is at midnight, and we have a travel agency that's open. And I'm not sure why they're open at midnight. Perhaps that was prearranged. But that's the way the teams bought the tickets, was through the travel agency, because the clue had directed them to go to a travel agency to buy the tickets. Once in Romania, the teams were supposed to find an airstrip and then also locate TNT Brothers, which looks like it's an aviation company. And this told teams that it was probably going to be some skydiving going on. Jazz and Jag left at 12:38 a.m. That's like 40 minutes after Tucker and Eric. And in third place, Kylan and Taylor left at 12:55 a.m., which is 15 minutes later than Jazz and Jag. And in fourth place, Nat and Steph, they left at 1:45 a.m. That's like 50 minutes after Kylan and Taylor. And one thing that Nat had said here at this particular point in the race is that because they're in fourth place, they need to fight in order to stay in the game. And that was going to be their game plan in this leg, was to fight. Okay, so let's see how much fighting that they do to stay in the game during this leg. Oh, and the other thing that Nat had said, that she had hoped that they were on the same flight as Joseph and Adam. They're still loyal to the Alliance, at least Nat is at this point. Joseph and Adam, they left 3 minutes later in fifth place. And they talked about sacrificing everything just to stay in the game. They're not thinking about the Alliance anymore. They're thinking about winning this thing, and it doesn't matter who they got to run over to get it. That's kind of what their mental thought was at this point. So the first 3 teams, Tucker and Eric, Kylan and Taylor, and Jazz and Jag, were all at the travel agency at about the same time. And they got flights that left at 6:50 a.m. that morning and arrived in Romania at 3:50 p.m. Now that's like 9 hours, isn't it? I looked at it and it seems like it's a 4-hour flight. So I'm not sure why, unless there's a couple of layovers or at least one long layover, on why it would take 9 hours to get there. But anyway, so the first flight arrives at 3:50 p.m. Whether it was intentional or not, Jazz and Jag did try to subtly sneak past Kylan and Taylor at the ticket counter at the travel agency. Because once Tucker and Eric got their tickets, then Jazz and Jag said, even though they came in third, they were there in third place, said, well, give us the same tickets. Which Kylan had said, hey, wait a minute here now, wait in line. Which just shows to me that the teams are getting more competitive. Jazz and Jag, again, whether it was intentional or not, they're thinking, we want to get ahead, we want to be first. And so that they blurted that out. And I just thought it was a good predictor of their mental state. It was at this point that Nat and Steph and Joseph and Adam showed up at the travel agency about the same time. Now I went back and I rewound the tape, and I went back and I looked to see who actually got there first. And the way it looked to me, and it was pretty clear, was that they entered girl, boy, girl, boy. So the two women were in the door at the travel agency first, and one of the men was not. They came in last. So therefore, in my mind, Nat and Steph should have been there in fourth place to get their tickets. But what happened was that Joseph and Adam started the ticket process. They handed the guy their passport and started the process. And they didn't even think of the alliance. Even the ticket counter person that was there, handling the tickets, asked whether they were going to be gentlemen and let the women go first, to which they said, no, it's a race. But actually, they jumped in line. And the other thing about this is that Nat and Steph, they let it happen. They just let it happen. They didn't fight like they said they were going to. They didn't question it. They just accepted it and said, oh, well, we'll go on the later flight. Because there was only one more spot on that first flight. And Joseph and Adam got it. And Nat and Steph had to wait for the next flight. But they let it happen. I can't fault Joseph and Adam for that. It's a race. It's competition. They're doing what they need to win. But Nat and Steph, I think, just did not fight hard enough to get their place in line and to push back and say, nope, we were next, and at least flip a coin for it if there was a question about it. But they didn't even do that. And the look on Nat's face said it all. She knew right there that she had been betrayed. She had trusted them, and she was betrayed. And it was Steph who'd been questioning the alliance for the past two legs. She was the one wondering whether it was worth it or not to go backwards and help people and to stop the race, to do that. And Natalie had been using that alliance like a crutch, depending on the alliance to help them get through the race. But at that point in the travel agency, Joseph and Adam kicked that crutch right out from underneath them, and Natalie fell to the ground. Hey, how you like that one? That's pretty good. That's pretty good visual, huh? All right, let's get back to the race here. All right, so that second flight that Natalie and Stephanie had to take, it arrived at 8:35 p.m. the next day. Now remember, the first flight was 3:50. This one is 8:35, so like 4.5 hours later than that first flight. And nowhere did we see when that flight took off. So we don't know how long that flight was. Perhaps there was a shorter layover, perhaps it was a direct flight. But in any case, it did arrive 4.5 hours later than the first flight. 3 hours behind the leaders, Jack and Chelsea left at 2:57 a.m. And then just 3 minutes later, Izzy and Paige left. So they were pretty tightly bunched up back there at the back of the pack. Okay, just a quick summary here. So you got Tucker and Eric, Kylan and Taylor, Jazz and Jag, and Joseph and Adam on that first flight that arrives at 3:50. Then on the second flight was Natalie and Steph, Jack and Chelsea, and Izzy and Paige, and they arrived at 8:30. So when that first flight landed, it did land on time, and all of the teams did leave the airport and arrive at the taxis at the same time. And Joseph and Adam, they were the first ones to arrive at the airstrip, and when they found the clue box, they had to take a number, and they were number 1. Tucker and Eric was number 2, Kylan and Taylor 3rd, and Jazz and Jag 4th. And when they opened their clue, it said they'd be facing a roadblock, which is one team member would do the skydiving. And in this particular case, Phil did mention that it was the highest skydiving they've ever done in the Amazing Race at 13,000 feet. But it would be done the next morning. So what would they do between then, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and early next morning? They would sleep in these portable shelters that were there at the airstrip. They had bunk beds in them. So off to bed they went to catch up on their sleep. So the second flight landed at 8:35, and they headed off to the airstrip, and it was dark. So they got to the airstrip, they got to the shelters, and Jack had decided that he was going to barged right into Joseph and Adam's shelter. So he flipped on the light and barged in and said hello. And they had a little mini reunion, all the teams together now. And it was really the first time in a long time that the teams really got together, all together. And it was then that Jazz and Jag saw that Izzy and Paige were still in the race. And of course, on their face, you could tell that they were being polite. They were trying to be happy, but they weren't particularly happy about that. And that's also where Tucker found out that Rubina had been eliminated, and that's, his girlfriend, and he had learned her fate. And when the second group arrived and they drew numbers, we learned that Nat and Steph were last. They had started the day in 4th place, but now they're in 7th place and in last place. And the next morning, 3 teams went skydiving on the first aircraft. That's all I guess they could fit on the airplane. So that was Joseph and Adam, Kylan and Taylor, and Tucker and Eric. Now, Jazz and Jag, they were on the second flight, and they were on the airplane by themselves. So there wasn't room for them on that first airplane, so they got a whole airplane just for themselves. And there was a third airplane that did take Izzy and Paige, Jack and Chelsea, and Nat and Steph up for their skydiving. Now, only one team member from each team did the skydiving, even though I'm saying both names. Only one person did do that. And Taylor was the first one on the ground, so she ended up landing first. But it was Tucker and Eric who left and went across the street for the next task. They did that first, so they were in first place after that. It seemed to me Kylan and Taylor were hugging and celebrating her flight, and Tucker and Eric passed them. They weren't doing any of that nonsense. And that next task was for both team members to herd 5 sheep into a little corral by separating them from a much larger herd. So because the sheep like to stick together, that made it difficult, and there was some, comedy involved with them trying to separate it, and that sheep wouldn't listen. But Tucker and Eric were the first ones to finish that. So off to the next task they went, and they did some self-driving. So there were rental cars at the airstrip. So they were at the airstrip. They had to cross the road over to where the sheep were. When they were done with that, then teams then had to go back to the airstrip and get a rental car there and drive themselves to the next task, which was trying to find a pond. They had to go find this pond and then build a pontoon and then float themselves out to the clue box in the middle of this pond and get their next clue. Now at the skydiving, Paige seemed to have the most difficulty with that. She looked like she had her eyes closed, her head back, and was just tolerating it until she got onto the ground. But it was Nat and Steph who were the last ones to complete the skydive. However, they were able to pass Izzy and Paige at the sheep herding task. So it was Izzy and Paige who were in last place when they went to the pontoon task. And Izzy and Paige were the last teams to complete that. And the last task for the leg was a detour. They had a choice. Teams could either make bricks out of dirt, straw, and manure, or they could sew some cloth masks. Now, all the teams except Izzy and Paige decided to make the bricks. Now, why you would use manure in those bricks, I'm not sure. It would seem to me that you would have a stinky house if you used manure to build your bricks with. But apparently that's the local tradition, and that's what they had done. And being in last place, Izzy and Paige had decided to do the masks. They felt that was the only way that they could possibly catch up with the other teams. They knew that building the bricks was probably a set amount of time to do that. And if they had any chance, they had to take a risk and do a different task. Otherwise, they would just get the same result as everyone else. So they went off to build their mask. And it was Tucker and Eric who was first again that leg. They're 4th in a row, and they won $5,000 each. And it was Jazz and Jag who came in 2nd. Joseph and Adam came in 3rd. And when they got to the pit stop there, they were trying to hug Phil because they smelled with all the manure, and Phil was running around trying to avoid them. And that was a pretty funny moment then. Kylan and Taylor came in 4th, and they could have beaten Joseph and Adam in the foot race, but they had followed Joseph and Adam in the car, So they made a little mini deal that they would allow Joseph and Adam to come in third and they would take fourth. And for fifth and sixth place, it was a foot race between Jack and Chelsea and Izzy and Paige. And Jack and Chelsea, they just outran. They were a little bit faster than Izzy and Paige. And so they took fifth and Izzy and Paige sixth. That left the last spot, and that was Natalie and Stephanie. They came in last and they were eliminated. But I will say that her elimination speech was really good. I really liked her speech that she had given at the end. I thought that was really good and poignant. All right, so here are some thoughts on this particular leg. It was Joseph and Adam. They completely disintegrated that alliance. They just totally destroyed Nat and Steph there at the travel agency, and they never recovered. Natalie and Stephanie just did not recover from that. So that alliance, I believe, is over. And we've already talked about it. Natalie and Stephanie, I just think they let it happen. They didn't put up as much of a fight as I think they could have to try to stay in that race. And I also noticed that with Natalie and Stephanie, they did bicker more this leg than they did others, which was unusual for them. But they did do that, and I think that might have had, an effect on how well they ran the leg. And another thought here is that Izzy and Paige thought it was a good decision that they went and they did the mask task versus making bricks. It did allow them to pass Natalie and Steph, and that way it allowed them to take sixth place and avoid elimination. And so it was a risk. They took it. It paid off for them, and they'll race another leg. And we have Jazz and Jag and Kylan and Taylor both still have their express passes. They have not used them yet, but they must use them or lose them here in this next leg. So we will see if they do run into a situation where they have to use them or they want to use them. One thing that I think they could use them for is to try to jump ahead of Tucker and Eric, who just seem unstoppable at this point. They just seem to be doing all the tasks well, navigating well, getting along well. They're just a strong team. So the express passes could be used to help with that, to try to pass those two. The other thing, a second thing that they could use that express pass for, is to make sure that they stay ahead of Izzy and Paige, at least Jazz and Jag, because that's in the back of their mind, is that if Izzy and Paige get ahead of Jazz and Jag, at the next U-turn, they could get U-turned. So they're going to always want to stay ahead of Izzy and Paige. Now, I do believe that what we have coming up here in future legs is we will have another U-turn. There will be another U-turn coming up and possibly a non-elimination leg. So that'll throw another twist in there. Now, whether we have any more complications like we saw with the driver's seat, that's still up in the air. We may, and that'll add some more complexity to the game. And it is here, I think, that we will end this podcast session for today. Thanks for listening. I do appreciate you listening and joining in. And join me next time for Jason's Amazing Race Recap 38. And we will find out what happens on leg 8 with our racers. See you then.